never thought she'd see him again. But when Sarah returns to the very canyon where her life was saved as a child, what she finds changes everything. A powerful warrior, a promise unbroken, and a love neither time nor war could silence. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the merciless sun of 1868, its red rock formations standing like ancient sentinels over a land torn by conflict. The small settlement of Copper Ridge huddled beneath the shadow of the Superstition Mountains, a fragile outpost where American settlers attempted to carve out lives on land that had belonged to the Apache for generations. Tension hung thick in the air, as heavy as the dust that coated everything it touched. Sarah Mitchell was only 7 years old when her world shattered. She had been playing near the creek that ran behind her family's modest homestead, her fingers trailing through the cool water as she watched minnows dart between the rocks. Her mother had warned her not to wander far, but the afternoon sun was warm and the sound of the water was soothing. She didn't hear the approaching horses until it was too late. The raiders weren't Apache. They were white men, outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory for months, stealing, killing, and blaming their crimes on the native tribes to stir up more conflict. Sarah's scream pierced the air as rough hands grabbed her, lifting her small body onto a horse. The world became a blur of motion and terror as she was carried away from everything she knew. The outlaws rode hard into the wilderness, laughing cruelly as Sarah sobbed. Their leader, a scarred man named Dutch Keller, planned to ransom her back to her family or sell her to traders heading further west. They made camp in a rocky canyon as the sun began to set, building a fire and passing around a bottle of whiskey, paying little attention to the terrified child they'd bound near a boulder. Sarah's tears had run dry by the time darkness fell. Her wrists ached from the rough rope, and her throat was raw from crying. She closed her eyes, praying silently for her mother and father, wondering if she would ever see them again. The outlaws' voices grew louder and more slurred as they drank, their shadows dancing grotesquely against the canyon walls in the firelight. Then, like a whisper on the wind, everything changed. The first outlaw fell without a sound, an arrow protruding from his chest. The others scrambled to their feet, reaching for their weapons, but the attack came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah watched through wide, frightened eyes as figures moved through the shadows with impossible grace and precision. When the chaos ended, 5 outlaws lay dead or dying, and standing before Sarah was a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old. He was Apache, lean and strong for his age, with intelligent dark eyes that assessed her with a mixture of caution and concern. His long black hair was held back with a leather band, and he wore traditional clothing decorated with intricate beadwork. He carried a bow that seemed almost too large for him, yet he wielded it with the confidence of a seasoned warrior. The boy studied Sarah for a long moment before approaching. Behind him, 3 adult Apache warriors emerged from the shadows, speaking rapidly in their language. The boy responded, gesturing towards Sarah, and after what seemed like heated discussion, he knelt beside her and began working on the ropes binding her wrists. "You are safe now," he said in heavily accented but clear English, surprising her. "They will not hurt you anymore." Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Who are you?" "I am Nahyo. It means brave in my language." He finished untying her and helped her stand on shaky legs. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure. Her legs felt like water beneath her. Nahyo called out to the warriors, and one of them brought forward a canteen of water. The boy offered it to Sarah, watching as she drank greedily. "We track these bad men for 2 days," Nahyo explained, his young face serious beyond his years. "They kill Apache family, steal horses, and blame us. We follow to bring justice, but we did not know they take white child." His expression softened slightly as he looked at her tear-stained face. "You are very brave. Not many children stay so quiet when they are afraid." One of the adult warriors spoke sharply, clearly wanting to leave. Nahyo replied firmly, then turned back to Sarah. "We take you near your home, but we cannot go to settlement. Your people shoot first, ask questions later." There was no bitterness in his voice, only matter-of-fact acceptance of a harsh reality. Sarah found her voice, though it trembled. "Thank you for saving me. I thought I was going to die." Something flickered in Nahyo's eyes, recognition of shared humanity perhaps, or simply the natural compassion of a boy who understood fear and suffering. Death comes for everyone someday, but today is not your day. He glanced at the night sky, reading the stars as easily as Sarah might read a book. Come, we must go before more bad men come, or soldiers who will not understand. The journey through the darkness was surreal. Sarah rode in front of one of the warriors on his horse, while Nahyo ran alongside with a stamina that seemed impossible. They moved swiftly and silently through terrain that would have been treacherous even in daylight, but these people knew every rock, every canyon, every hidden path. As they traveled, Nahyo would occasionally look up at Sarah and offer small reassurances. Not far now. You see your mother soon. His English was practiced, suggesting he'd had contact with settlers before, perhaps learning from traders or missionaries who had passed through Apache territory. After what felt like hours, they stopped on a ridge overlooking Copper Ridge. In the distance, Sarah could see the faint lights of the settlement, looking small and vulnerable against the vast darkness of the desert night. Nahyo approached and helped Sarah down from the horse. You can walk from here. Follow the North Star until you reach the big rock that looks like a bear. Then go down the hill. You will see your home. Sarah felt a sudden surge of emotion. This boy, this Apache boy, who her people feared and hated, had saved her life when white men had tried to destroy it. She reached out impulsively and hugged him, her small arms barely reaching around his lean frame. Nahyo stiffened in surprise, clearly unused to such gestures, especially from a white child. But after a moment, he awkwardly patted her back. Go now. Be safe, little one. And remember, not all Apache are your enemy, and not all white men are your friend. The world is more complicated than the stories people tell. Sarah pulled back, looking up at him with solemn eyes that seemed older than her 7 years. I'll remember. I promise I'll never forget you, Nahyo. Never. The boy smiled slightly, a rare expression that transformed his serious face. Go. Your mother worries. He stepped back, melting into the shadows with the warriors, and within moments it was as if they had never been there at all. Sarah ran toward home, her feet flying over the rocky ground, no longer feeling the exhaustion that had weighed her down. She ran until she saw the familiar outline of her family's homestead, until she heard her mother's anguished crying, until she burst through the door and into her parents' shocked and joyful arms. The reunion was chaotic. Her mother sobbed and held her so tightly Sarah could barely breathe. Her father, a stern man named Thomas Mitchell who rarely showed emotion, wept openly as he checked her for injuries. The local sheriff and several townsmen were there, planning a search party that would have likely ended in more bloodshed and misunderstanding. Who took you, Sarah? Where have you been? Her father demanded once the initial shock wore off. His hands gripped her shoulders and she could see the fear and rage warring in his eyes. Sarah took a deep breath and told them everything. The white outlaws who had kidnapped her, the Apache warriors who had saved her, and especially Nahyo, the young brave who had spoken to her with kindness and returned her safely home. The room fell silent. The sheriff, a weathered man named Bill Carson, shook his head slowly. Girl, you sure they were white men who took you? Not Apache dressed up to fool you? I'm sure, Sarah insisted, her voice gaining strength. They spoke English the whole time. They were going to sell me, and the Apache killed them to save me. Nahyo saved me. Her father's face was a mask of conflicting emotions. He was a man who had fought in the Mexican-American War, who had come west seeking opportunity, and who had been taught to view all Indians as savages. Yet here was his daughter, alive and unharmed, telling him that an Apache boy had risked his life to save her. Thomas, her mother, Elizabeth, said softly, her hand stroking Sarah's hair. She's home. That's what matters. Maybe we've been wrong about some things. But Sarah could see in the faces of the men around her that her story would change nothing. They would continue to hate and fear the Apache. They would continue to see them as the enemy, just as the Apache had every reason to see the settlers as invaders and murderers. The cycle of violence and misunderstanding would continue, no matter what one brave boy had done. That night, as Sarah lay in her own bed, clean and fed and safe, she stared at the ceiling and thought about Nahyo. She wondered where he was, if he was safe, if he had a family who worried about him the way her mother had worried about her. She touched the place on her wrists where the rope had chafed, already forming small bruises, physical evidence of her ordeal. But more than that, she felt the ghost of that unexpected hug, the moment when two children from different worlds had connected in simple, uncomplicated humanity. She whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, Nayo. I won't forget. I promise." 15 years had passed since that fateful night in the Arizona desert. Sarah Mitchell was now 22 years old, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her fierce independence and compassionate heart. The years had transformed the frightened child into a striking young woman, with long auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper, intelligent green eyes that missed nothing, and a determination that often frustrated her family and admirers alike. Copper Ridge had grown considerably since 1868. What had been a small settlement was now a proper town with a main street, a general store, a saloon, a church, and even a small schoolhouse where Sarah taught reading and writing to the children of settlers and miners. The railroad had reached nearby territories, bringing more people, more commerce, and inevitably, more conflict with the Apache tribes whose lands continued to shrink under the relentless pressure of westward expansion. Sarah had never forgotten Nayo. How could she? While the other townspeople spoke of Indians with fear and hatred, she remembered kind, dark eyes and a boy's gentle voice telling her she was brave. She had kept her promise, holding on to that memory like a precious secret, even as the years passed and the world around her grew more complicated and violent. The morning of June 15th, 1883, began like any other. Sarah rose early, dressed in a practical navy blue dress with minimal adornment, and prepared her lessons for the day. Her students would be working on their penmanship, and she had planned to read them a chapter from one of the adventure novels that had recently arrived from back east. But as she walked toward the schoolhouse, she noticed unusual activity in town. A group of cavalry soldiers had ridden in, their uniforms dusty from hard travel, their faces grim. Captain James Harrison, a man in his mid-30s with blonde hair and cold blue eyes, was speaking with Sheriff Carson and several prominent townsmen outside the general store. Sarah slowed her pace, close enough to hear but trying not to appear too obviously interested. She had learned over the years that women were often ignored in such gatherings, which meant she could gather information others might try to keep from her. "The Apache have been raiding settlements to the south," Captain Harrison was saying, his voice clipped and authoritative. "We've been ordered to round up any remaining bands and relocate them to the San Carlos Reservation. Those who resist will be dealt with accordingly." Sarah's heart clenched. She knew what dealt with accordingly meant. It meant violence, bloodshed, families torn apart. She thought of Nahyo, wondered if he was still alive, if he was among those who would be hunted. "About time," one of the townsmen said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "They've been a menace long enough. Should have driven them out years ago." Sheriff Carson nodded, though he looked less enthusiastic than the others. He was older now, his hair nearly white, and he'd seen enough violence to know it rarely solved anything permanently. "When do you plan to start your sweep, Captain?" "Tomorrow at dawn. We'll be working our way through the canyons and mountains systematically. I'd advise all civilians to stay close to town for the next few weeks. Any Apache found off reservation land will be considered hostile." Harrison's eyes swept across the gathered men, then landed briefly on Sarah. "Miss Mitchell, this doesn't concern you. Shouldn't you be at the schoolhouse?" Sarah met his gaze evenly, refusing to be dismissed. "I was just heading there, Captain. Though I'd argue that anything affecting this community concerns all of us, not just the men." She didn't wait for his response, continuing toward the schoolhouse with her head held high, even as she heard some of the men chuckling behind her. The school day passed in a blur. Sarah tried to focus on her students, but her mind kept wandering to the captain's words. That night, lying in bed, she made a decision that would have horrified her family. She would ride out to the old canyon where Nahyo had returned her 15 years ago. It was foolish, perhaps even suicidal, but she felt compelled to go, driven by a debt she'd carried for half her lifetime, and by something else she couldn't quite name. Before dawn the next morning, Sarah dressed in her riding clothes, a practical split skirt and sturdy blouse, and quietly saddled her mare, a gentle chestnut named Willow. She left a note saying she was visiting a sick family outside town, knowing her parents would worry, but hoping they wouldn't raise an alarm until she returned. The ride to the canyon took several hours. The landscape had changed little since her childhood, still wild and beautiful, still dangerous. As she approached the familiar rock formations, memories flooded back. The terror of being kidnapped, the relief of rescue, Nahyo's serious young face. Sarah dismounted and led Willow deeper into the canyon, unsure what she was looking for or what she would do if she found it. The morning sun was climbing higher, painting the red rocks in shades of crimson and gold. The beauty of it all struck her forcefully, making her understand why the Apache fought so hard to keep this land. She didn't see the warriors until they wanted to be seen. One moment she was alone, and the next 3 Apache men on horseback had materialized from behind the rocks, surrounding her. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, raising her hands to show she carried no weapon. The warriors spoke rapidly among themselves in Apache, gesturing toward her and her horse. They looked wary but not immediately hostile. One of them, older with gray streaking his long black hair, rode closer and addressed her in broken English. "You lost, white woman. This not safe place for you." Sarah took a breath, knowing how insane she must sound. "I'm looking for someone, an Apache warrior named Nahyo. He saved my life 15 years ago, and I need to warn him. The cavalry is coming. They're going to sweep these canyons starting today." The warriors exchanged glances, and something shifted in their expressions. The older one studied her more carefully, his eyes narrowing. "You are the child, the one taken by bad white men. Nahyo speak of you sometimes. Say you remember him." Sarah's breath caught. "He's alive? He's here?" Before the warrior could answer, another voice rang out across the canyon, strong and commanding. "Kasale, what is happening here?" Sarah turned toward the voice and felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Riding toward them was a man who could only be Nahyo, though he bore little resemblance to the 12-year-old boy from her memories. He was tall and powerfully built, his broad shoulders and muscular frame evidence of years of training and survival. His hair hung long and black down his back, with traditional warrior's ornaments woven into it. His face had matured into strong, handsome features, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but his eyes, those intelligent, compassionate dark eyes, were the same. He pulled his horse to a stop, and for a long moment, he simply stared at Sarah, recognition dawning slowly across his face. "Little one?" he said in English, his voice deeper now but still carrying that same careful pronunciation. "Is it truly you?" "Nahyo," Sarah breathed, unable to say anything else. 15 years collapsed into nothing. She was 7 years old again, looking up at her rescuer with gratitude and awe. But she was also a woman now, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as a child's hero, but as a man of extraordinary presence and quiet strength. Nahyo dismounted in one fluid motion and approached her slowly, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. Up close, Sarah could see the small scars that marked his skin, evidence of battles fought and survived. He wore traditional Apache clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and carried weapons that spoke of his status as a warrior. "You should not be here," he said, though his tone held wonder rather than anger. "It is dangerous for you, your people and my people. We are at war again. I know. That's why I came. I had to warn you. The cavalry is sweeping through the canyons. Captain Harrison said they'll relocate any Apache they find to San Carlos Reservation and kill anyone who resists. You have to leave. Go somewhere safe." Nahyo's expression hardened slightly. "There is nowhere safe. San Carlos is a death trap. Disease, starvation, no freedom. Many of our people have already been taken there. The rest of us refuse to go. We will fight first." The older warrior, Kasale, spoke urgently in Apache. Nahyo responded in the same language, his tone firm but respectful. Then he turned back to Sarah, and she saw conflict warring in his eyes. "You risk much by coming here. If your people knew, they would call you traitor. If cavalry finds you with us, they might not believe you came willingly." He paused, studying her face as if trying to memorize every detail. "Why do you take this risk? The debt between us was paid long ago. You owe me nothing." Sarah met his gaze steadily. feeling something shift inside her, something that had perhaps been building for 15 years without her fully realizing it. Maybe I came because some debts go beyond owing. You saved my life, Nahyo. You showed me that the world isn't as simple as hatred and fear. I couldn't let you walk into a trap without warning you. Something softened in Nahyo's expression, a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his warrior's bearing. You have kind heart, just as you did when you were child. World has not made you hard and cruel like it makes so many. Another warrior rode up quickly, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward the canyon entrance. Nahyo's face went taut with tension. He turned to Sarah urgently. Cavalry comes, they are closer than we thought. You must go now, quickly, before they see you here with us. Come with me, Sarah said impulsively, grabbing his arm. Come to town. I'll vouch for you. You can claim you're a scout or a guide, anything to keep you safe. Nahyo looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face, and for a moment, Sarah saw something deep and powerful in his eyes that made her heart race. But he gently removed her hand, shaking his head. I cannot hide among your people while mine suffer and die. I am warrior. My place is here, fighting for my land, my family, my way of life. He glanced toward the sound of approaching horses, then back to her with sudden intensity. But I will remember that you came. I will remember that even now, when most white people want only to destroy us, you risked everything to help. That means more than you know. The sound of cavalry horses echoed through the canyon, growing louder. Kasale shouted something urgent, and the warriors began moving toward defensive positions. Sarah, Nahyo said, using her name for the first time, and the sound of it on his lips sent a shiver through her. If I survive this, if the spirits are merciful, and we both live through what is coming, I will find you again. This I promise. Now go quickly, before the soldiers see you and think you are captive. Sarah wanted to argue, to protest, to somehow make him understand that she couldn't bear the thought of riding away while he faced danger. But the rational part of her mind knew he was right. If the cavalry found her here, it would only make things worse for everyone. Be safe, she whispered, then turned and mounted Willow, urging the mare into a gallop back toward town. As she rode, tears streamed down her face and she refused to look back, afraid of what she might see, terrified that this would be the last time she ever saw Nahyo alive. Behind her, gunfire erupted, the sharp crack of rifles mixing with war cries and the screams of horses. Sarah bent low over Willow's neck and rode harder, her heart breaking with every shot she heard, praying to a god she wasn't sure was listening that Nahyo would survive, that somehow, impossibly, his promise to find her again would come true. Sarah rode back to Copper Ridge in a state of barely controlled panic, her mind replaying the sound of gunfire echoing through the canyon. By the time she reached the edge of town, the sun was high overhead, and she forced herself to slow Willow to a walk, trying to compose herself before anyone saw her. Her hands trembled on the reins, and she could feel dried tears tight on her cheeks. As she approached her family's home, she saw her father standing on the porch, his arms crossed and his expression thunderous. Thomas Mitchell had aged considerably over the years, his hair now completely gray, but his stern demeanor had only intensified with time. "Where have you been?" he demanded as Sarah dismounted. "Your mother has been worried sick. You said you were visiting the Hendersons, but I rode out there myself and they haven't seen you." Sarah led Willow toward the small stable, buying herself time to think. She had never been good at lying to her father, but the truth would only bring more trouble. "I needed to clear my head, Papa. I rode out toward the old canyon. I'm sorry I worried you and Mama." Thomas followed her, his boots heavy on the packed earth. "The old canyon? Sarah, that's Apache territory. What possessed you to go there, especially today? The cavalry is conducting operations in that exact area. You could have been killed." "I know," Sarah said quietly, removing Willow's saddle with practiced efficiency. "I heard gunfire. I turned back immediately." Her father's expression shifted from anger to concern. He reached out and gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Sarah, you're 22 years old now, not a child. But sometimes you act with the same reckless disregard for safety that you showed when you were 7. This hatred you have for what's happening to the Apache, I understand it comes from what happened when you were young, but you need to let it go. These are dangerous times, and your sympathy for them could get you hurt or worse. Sarah pulled away, frustration rising in her chest. They're human beings, Papa. They're fighting for their homes, their families. How can I just ignore that? Because it's not your fight, Thomas said firmly. Your fight is here with your own people. Speaking of which, Captain Harrison has been asking about you. He's a good man from a respectable family back east. He could provide well for you. The suggestion made Sarah's stomach turn. She had noticed the captain's attention over the past few weeks, the way his eyes lingered on her, the overly polite inquiries about her well-being. There was something cold in James Harrison, something that reminded her of the men who had kidnapped her all those years ago. A sense of entitlement, a belief that the world and everyone in it existed for his benefit. I'm not interested in Captain Harrison, Sarah said flatly, and I'm perfectly capable of providing for myself. I have my teaching position. Her father sighed heavily. Teaching doesn't pay enough to live on your own, and it's not a permanent solution. You need a husband, Sarah, someone to take care of you. I don't need anyone to take care of me, Sarah replied, hanging Willow's saddle on the stable wall with more force than necessary. And I certainly don't need James Harrison. The argument was cut short by the sound of horses entering town. Sarah and her father emerged from the stable to see Captain Harrison and his cavalry unit returning, their horses lathered with sweat and several men sporting fresh bandages. The captain himself looked grim but satisfied, and Sarah's heart sank. Harrison dismounted in front of the general store where a crowd was gathering. His uniform was dusty, and there was a streak of what looked like blood on his sleeve, though he appeared uninjured himself. "Report, Captain?" Sheriff Carson asked, approaching with several townsmen. Harrison removed his gloves methodically, his movements precise and controlled. "We engaged a small band of Apache warriors in Redstone Canyon. They fought fiercely, but we prevailed. 5 hostiles killed, 3 wounded and captured. We lost 1 man and have 4 injured." He paused, his blue eyes scanning the crowd until they found Sarah. "We also found evidence of a recent visitor to the canyon. A woman on horseback, judging by the tracks. Anyone here know anything about that?" Sarah felt her father tense beside her, but she stepped forward before he could speak. "That was me, Captain. I was out riding this morning and didn't realize I had strayed so close to the canyon. When I heard gunfire, I turned back immediately." Harrison's eyes narrowed, studying her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Strange place for a morning ride, Miss Mitchell. Especially on a day when military operations were planned. Makes a man wonder if perhaps someone warned the Apache we were coming. They seemed unusually prepared for our arrival." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt the eyes of the entire town on her, saw suspicion dawn on some faces, shock on others. Her father moved to stand beside her, his presence protective despite their earlier argument. "My daughter is many things, Captain, but she's no traitor," Thomas said, his voice hard as iron. "She's lived in this town her entire life. Whatever foolishness led her to ride out this morning, it had nothing to do with your military operations." Harrison held Thomas's gaze for a long moment, then shrugged slightly. "Of course, I meant no offense. Just seemed like quite a coincidence." He turned to address the crowd again. "The 3 Apache prisoners will be held temporarily in the town jail before being transported to Fort Grant. I want guards posted at all times. These are dangerous savages, and I won't have them escaping or being freed by sympathizers." That last word was clearly directed at Sarah, and she felt anger rise hot in her chest. But she bit her tongue, knowing that any protest would only make things worse. As the crowd began to disperse, each person heading back to their daily business or clustering in groups to gossip about the day's events, Sarah felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the boarding house, looking at her with kind but worried eyes. "Come to my house for tea, dear. We should talk." Sarah glanced at her father, who nodded reluctantly. "Go on. But come straight home afterward." Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was a well-kept 2-story building on the edge of town. Once inside, the elderly woman busied herself making tea while Sarah sat in the parlor, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The sound of gunfire still echoed in her mind, and she couldn't stop wondering about Nahyo. Was he among the dead, the wounded? Had he escaped? "Here, drink this," Mrs. Henderson said, pressing a cup of chamomile tea into Sarah's hands. She settled into the chair across from her, studying Sarah's face with shrewd eyes that had seen more than most people gave her credit for. "Now, you want to tell me what really happened this morning?" Sarah looked down at her tea, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. Mrs. Henderson had always been kind to her, one of the few people in town who didn't lecture her about her unconventional views. "I can't, Mrs. Henderson. It would only bring trouble." "More trouble than Captain Harrison already suspects you of?" the old woman asked gently. "Sarah, I've known you since you were a baby. I was there the night you came home after being taken by those outlaws. I saw your face when you talked about the Apache boy who saved you. And I've watched you grow into a woman who can't quite reconcile what she knows to be true with what everyone around her believes." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes. "They killed 5 men today, Mrs. Henderson. 5 Apache warriors who were just trying to protect their land. And everyone in town is celebrating like it's a victory. How can they not see that we're the invaders here? That we're destroying an entire people?" Mrs. Henderson sighed, setting down her own teacup. "Because it's easier to see others as enemies than to question whether we might be wrong. But Sarah, you need to be careful. Captain Harrison is not a forgiving man, and he has the power to make life very difficult for you and your family. If he truly believes you warned those Apache warriors, he could bring charges against you." "I did warn them," Sarah said quietly, looking up to meet the old woman's eyes. "I found them in the canyon this morning. I told them the cavalry was coming." She took a shaky breath. "And I saw him again, Mrs. Henderson. Nah-yo. He's alive. He's a warrior now. And he's—" She trailed off, unable to find words for the complex emotions swirling inside her. Mrs. Henderson reached across and took Sarah's hand. "And you have feelings for him. Real feelings, not just gratitude from a childhood rescue." Sarah nodded, tears finally spilling over. "I barely know him. We've met twice in our entire lives, but when I saw him today, when I looked into his eyes, I felt something I've never felt before. It was like recognizing someone I've known forever, even though we're strangers. Does that sound insane?" "It sounds like what happened to me when I met my late husband," Mrs. Henderson said with a sad smile. "Sometimes the heart knows things the mind can't explain. But Sarah, you must understand. Even if by some miracle this man feels the same way about you, there's no future there. Your worlds are too different, too much at war with each other." "I know," Sarah whispered, wiping at her tears. "But he promised to find me again if he survived. And I can't stop hoping that he did, even though it's foolish, even though nothing can come of it." The 2 women sat in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke again. "The 3 prisoners Harrison brought back. They're in the jail right now. Sheriff Carson is posting guards tonight. You're not thinking of doing anything foolish, are you?" Sarah looked up sharply. "I can't just leave them there to be sent to San Carlos. You've heard the stories about that place. It's a death sentence. So is being shot for aiding the enemy," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Sarah, I'm telling you this as someone who cares about you. Stay away from that jail. Let this situation resolve itself without your involvement. You've already taken enough risks for one day." But even as Sarah nodded agreement, both women knew it was a promise she might not be able to keep. Later that evening, after Sarah had returned home and endured a tense dinner with her worried parents, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The image of Nahyo's face kept appearing in her mind, the way he had looked at her before telling her to run, the promise in his voice when he said he would find her again. Somewhere in the darkness, 3 Apache prisoners sat in cells, waiting for a fate that would likely end in death or lifelong imprisonment. And somewhere out in the vast Arizona wilderness, Nahyo, if he had survived, was either wounded and hiding or planning his next move against an enemy with superior numbers and weapons. Sarah rose from her bed and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet town bathed in moonlight. In the distance, she could see the jail, could imagine the prisoners inside, could almost feel the weight of their despair. Mrs. Henderson was right. Getting involved would be foolish, possibly fatal. But how could she not try to help? How could she sleep soundly knowing she had the chance to save lives and chose comfort over courage? Her decision made, Sarah began to plan. She would need to be careful, patient, and very, very lucky. But she had not forgotten the lesson Nahyo had taught her 15 years ago, that sometimes the right thing to do was also the dangerous thing, and that true bravery meant acting despite fear, not without it. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, Sarah Mitchell, schoolteacher and daughter of settlers, began to transform into something else entirely, a woman willing to risk everything for what she believed was right, and perhaps, though she barely dared admit it even to herself, for the chance to see again the man who had captured her heart in a single, impossible moment. The next 2 days passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah went through the motions of her daily life, teaching her students, helping her mother with household chores, attending church on Sunday, while her mind worked constantly on the problem of the Apache prisoners. She had observed the jail from a distance, noting that 2 guards were posted at night, rotating every 4 hours. Captain Harrison visited the prisoners twice daily, his interrogations sometimes accompanied by sounds that made Sarah's blood run cold. On the 3rd night after the canyon battle, Sarah made her move. She had spent the afternoon baking bread and preparing a basket of food, telling her mother she planned to bring provisions to Mrs. Henderson, who had been feeling poorly. Instead, as darkness fell, she made her way quietly through the back streets of Copper Ridge toward the jail. The guards on duty were young soldiers, barely older than Sarah herself. She recognized them from church, Billy Thompson and Marcus Webb, local boys who had joined the cavalry more for steady pay than any real hatred of the Apache. Sarah approached with her basket, her heart pounding so hard she was certain they could hear it. "Evening, Miss Mitchell," Billy said, straightening up from where he'd been leaning against the jail wall. "What brings you out so late?" Sarah smiled, hoping it looked natural despite her nerves. "I brought you boys some fresh bread and apple pie. Thought you might appreciate something better than army rations while you're stuck on guard duty." Marcus's face lit up. "That's mighty kind of you, ma'am. We've been eating nothing but hardtack and jerky for days." As the young men eagerly examined the contents of her basket, Sarah glanced toward the jail door. "How are the prisoners? Are they being treated humanely?" Billy's expression grew uncomfortable. "Captain's orders are to keep them restrained and under constant watch. Can't say they look too comfortable, but then again, they did kill good men in that canyon fight. One of them's just a boy," Marcus added quietly, lowering his voice. "Can't be more than 16 or 17. Keeps calling out in his language. Don't know what he's saying, but it sounds like he's asking for someone." Sarah's chest tightened. "May I see them? Just for a moment. I'd like to bring them some water at least. Whatever they've done, they're still human beings." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. "I don't know, Miss Mitchell. Captain Harrison gave strict orders, no visitors without his permission." "I'm not asking to free them or even speak to them," Sarah said, putting every ounce of sincerity she possessed into her voice. "Just to give them water. Surely that can't violate any orders. What would Jesus do, Billy? Would he deny water to prisoners?" The religious appeal worked. Billy sighed and pulled out his keys. 5 minutes, Miss Mitchell, and you stay where we can see you. If the captain finds out, it's our necks on the line." Sarah followed the guards into the jail, where 3 cells held the Apache prisoners. 2 older warriors sat stoically in their cells, their faces impassive despite obvious injuries. But in the 3rd cell, as Marcus had said, was a young man barely out of boyhood, his face bruised and swollen, his left arm bound in a crude sling. Sarah approached slowly, with a ladle of water from the bucket near the door. As she got closer, the young prisoner looked up, and she saw desperation and fear in his eyes, emotions that transcended language and culture. "Water," she said softly, offering the ladle through the bars. The young man hesitated, then reached out with his good hand, drinking deeply. When he finished, he looked at her with something like gratitude. Then he spoke, his voice rough but surprisingly clear. "Nahyo lives. He asks about white woman with fire hair who came to Canyon. He says tell her he keeps promise." Sarah's breath caught. She glanced back at the guards, but they were far enough away and speaking to each other in low tones, not paying close attention. "Where is he?" she whispered urgently. "Safe place. He plans rescue, 3 days when moon is dark." The young man's eyes bored into hers. "You help from inside, yes?" You are the one he speaks of, the child he saved long ago. Before Sarah could respond, Billy called out, "Time's up, Miss Mitchell. Captain could ride by any time on his rounds." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She offered water to the other two prisoners, who accepted silently, their expressions unreadable. As she left the jail, she felt the weight of what she had just learned. Nahyo was alive. He was planning a rescue. And somehow he knew she would help. The next 3 days were the longest of Sarah's life. She continued her normal routine while planning carefully for what was to come. On the night of the rescue, she told her parents she was staying late at the schoolhouse to prepare lessons. Instead, she positioned herself in the shadows near the jail, her heart hammering with fear and anticipation. The new moon made the night exceptionally dark. Sarah waited, every nerve on edge, watching the guards pace their regular route. Then, so quietly she almost missed it, shadows began moving through the town. Apache warriors moving like ghosts between buildings, their knowledge of stealth and silence honed by generations of survival. Everything happened fast. One moment the guards were standing at their posts, and the next they were unconscious on the ground, taken down silently by warriors who materialized from the darkness. Sarah saw Nahyo among them, his face painted for war, his movements precise and deadly efficient. He saw her at the same moment, and their eyes met across the distance. Even in the darkness, even with the danger surrounding them, Sarah felt that same electric connection she'd experienced in the canyon. Nahyo moved toward her, while the other warriors worked on the jail door with tools that made quick work of the simple lock. "You should not be here," Nahyo said, but his voice held warmth beneath the urgency. "If you are caught, then I'll face the consequences," Sarah interrupted. "I couldn't let them be sent to San Carlos. I couldn't let them die without trying to help." Nahyo reached out and touched her face, a brief gesture that sent warmth flooding through her despite the cool night air. "You have the heart of a warrior, Sarah Mitchell, braver than many men I have known." The sound of the cell doors opening drew their attention. The 3 prisoners emerged, supported by their rescuers. The young one looked toward Sarah and nodded gratefully before being hurried away into the darkness. "You must go," Sarah urged Nahyo. "The guards will wake soon, or someone will notice the commotion. Get your people to safety." But Nahyo didn't move. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Come with us. Come with me. You do not belong in this town that treats you like prisoner for having compassion. You belong free, like the wind, like the eagle." Sarah's heart soared at the invitation even as her practical mind recognized the impossibility. "Nahyo, I can't. My family is here, my students, my entire life." "Your life is cage," he said softly. "I see it in your eyes. You are not happy here, not truly. They do not understand you and they never will." He took both her hands in his grip strong and warm. "In my world, woman who shows such courage, such loyalty, such strength, she is honored, respected. You would not have to hide who you are." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes. "And what would I be in your world? Your people have every reason to hate mine. How could they accept me? Because I would stand beside you. Because they would see what I see. A woman of honor who risks everything to do what is right. Who sees people as people, not as enemies." His voice dropped lower, more intimate. "Because in the 3 days I have planned this rescue, I have thought of nothing but you. Because when I thought I might die in that canyon, my only regret was that I would never see you again." Sarah's tears spilled over. Everything she had felt in the canyon, every impossible emotion she had tried to deny, came flooding back. She had fallen in love with this man, this Apache warrior who represented everything her world told her to fear and hate. And against all logic, against all odds, he felt the same. "If I come with you," she said, her voice shaking, "there's no going back. My family will think I've been kidnapped or killed. The cavalry will hunt for me. I'll be branded a traitor." "Yes," Nahyo said simply. "The choice is yours alone. I will not take you by force. But know this, if you choose to stay, I will carry the memory of you until my last breath. You will be the woman I should have fought harder to win, the happiness I let slip away because I was too honorable to insist." Behind them, one of the warriors hissed urgently in Apache. Time was running out. Sarah looked back toward her family's home, thought of her mother and father, her students, the life she had built. Then she looked at Nahyo, at the promise of freedom and acceptance and love unlike anything she had ever known. "Teach me," she said suddenly. "Teach me your language, your ways. If I'm going to live in your world, I want to truly belong there, not just exist as an outsider." Hope blazed in Nahyo's eyes. "You will come?" "Yes," Sarah breathed, and the word felt like liberation. "Yes, I'll come with you." Nahyo pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers in a gesture of profound intimacy. "Then we run now, and I will spend every day of my life making certain you never regret this choice." They ran through the darkness, Sarah's hand clasped firmly in Nahyo's as they fled Copper Ridge. Behind them, she heard shouts as the unconscious guards were discovered, as the alarm was raised. But ahead lay the open wilderness, freedom, and the beginning of a life she had never dared imagine. The Apache band moved swiftly through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate without their expertise. Sarah stumbled several times, unused to running in darkness over rough ground, but Nahyo was always there, steadying her, encouraging her, his presence a constant source of strength. They traveled for hours before finally stopping in a hidden canyon where horses waited. As Sarah caught her breath leaning against a rock wall, she saw the rescued prisoners embracing their families, saw the relief and joy on faces that had known too much suffering. Nahyo brought her water in a leather pouch, watching as she drank. "This is my people," he said, gesturing to the small group. "What remains of our band after years of fighting, of running, of losing family and friends to soldiers and disease and reservation life. We are few, but we are free." An older woman approached, her weathered face suspicious as she looked at Sarah. She spoke sharply in Apache, clearly questioning Nahyo's decision to bring a white woman into their midst. Nahyo responded calmly but firmly, his tone respectful but unyielding. The conversation went back and forth for several minutes before the woman finally nodded grudgingly and walked away. "My aunt," Nahyo explained. "She lost her husband and 2 sons to white soldiers. She does not trust easily, and I cannot blame her. But she accepts that you are here under my protection." "What did you tell her?" Sarah asked. "The truth, that you saved my life when I was young by not revealing our location to your people, that you came to warn us of the cavalry attack, risking your own safety, and that you helped free our warriors from the jail." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. "And I told her that you are important to me, that I wish you to stay, if you will have me and accept our ways." Over the following weeks, Sarah began her transformation from settler's daughter to Apache woman. It was not easy. The language was complex, the customs unfamiliar, and many in the band remained suspicious of her presence. But Sarah threw herself into learning with the same determination she had once applied to her studies. Doyo was patient, teaching her words and phrases, explaining traditions, helping her understand the Apache worldview that saw humans as part of nature rather than masters of it. At night, they would sit by the fire, and he would tell her stories of his people, of their history and struggles. And slowly, carefully, they built something deeper than gratitude or attraction. They built understanding, partnership, love. The physical attraction between them was undeniable, but Nahyo moved slowly, respectfully, waiting for Sarah to feel comfortable in her new life before pursuing anything more intimate. When they finally kissed for the first time, under a sky blazing with stars, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. 2 souls finding each other across impossible divides. 3 months after Sarah's flight from Copper Ridge, word reached the band that Captain Harrison had been recalled east, his aggressive tactics having created more problems than they solved. The new commander at Fort Grant was reportedly more interested in negotiation than extermination. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. Sarah stood on a ridge overlooking the vast Arizona landscape, Nahyo beside her. She wore Apache clothing now, her long auburn hair braided in the traditional style, her skin bronzed from constant sun. She had learned to ride Apache horses, to help with cooking and camp maintenance, to speak enough of the language to communicate basic needs and wants. "Do you regret it?" Nahyo asked softly, though he asked this question less frequently now than he had in the early days. "Leaving your old life?" Sarah considered the question honestly. She missed her mother sometimes, wondered how her father had taken the news of her disappearance. She hoped they believed she had been kidnapped, that it would be easier than knowing she had chosen to leave. But regret? No. I regret the pain I caused my family, she said. But I don't regret choosing freedom, choosing you. She turned to face him, taking his hands in hers. In Copper Ridge, I was living half a life, always hiding parts of myself, always pretending to be smaller and simpler than I was. Here I can be whole. Nahayo pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. My brave one, my heart, I will protect you and honor you all my days. That evening, as the band gathered for the evening meal, Nahayo stood and spoke formally in Apache. Sarah had learned enough to understand most of what he said. He was declaring his intention to take her as his wife, if she would accept, according to Apache tradition. All eyes turned to Sarah. This was the moment where she could still refuse, still maintain some separation between herself and full acceptance into the tribe. But she had made her choice months ago, on that dark night when she fled everything familiar. Now she simply made it official. Yes, she said in careful Apache, the words still feeling unfamiliar on her tongue. I accept. I wish to be his wife, to join fully with this people, to make my life here. The older woman, who was Nahyo's aunt, stood and approached Sarah. For a long moment, she simply studied the younger woman's face, searching for something. Then, to Sarah's surprise, she smiled, a rare expression that transformed her weathered features. You have strong spirit, she said in halting English, clearly making an effort. You belong here. Welcome, daughter. The ceremony took place 3 days later, conducted according to Apache traditions that Sarah was still learning to understand fully. But she understood the essential truth of it. She was binding her life to Nahyo's, choosing to build a future together, despite all the obstacles they would face. As Nahyo placed a necklace of turquoise and silver around her neck, as they shared food and water in symbolic unity, as the band celebrated around them with singing and dancing, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged, not because it was easy or comfortable, but because it was true. That night, in the privacy of the dwelling they would now share, Nahyo held her close and whispered in her ear, mixing English and Apache in the way they often communicated. I have loved you since you were 7 years old, and hugged me with such trust and gratitude. I have loved the memory of you for 15 years, and now I will love the reality of you for the rest of my life. Sarah pulled back to look into his eyes, seeing in them all the love and devotion she felt reflected back at her. When you saved me in that canyon, you gave me back my life. Today I give it to you freely by choice. We'll face whatever comes together. The months turned into years. The Apache wars continued, though with less intensity as both sides grew weary of bloodshed. The band moved with the seasons, always staying one step ahead of cavalry patrols, always seeking the freedom to live according to their own ways. Sarah became fully fluent in Apache, earning respect through her hard work and willingness to learn. She learned healing arts from the older women, how to preserve food, how to make clothing and tools. She bore Nahyo a son, then a daughter, children who belonged to both worlds and would perhaps someday help bridge them. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Sarah thought of her parents, wondered if they were still alive, if they ever thought of her. She hoped they had found peace with her disappearance, though she knew that was unlikely. The pain of leaving them was the price she had paid for her freedom, and while it still ached sometimes, she had never once regretted her choice. 10 years after fleeing Copper Ridge, Sarah and Nahyo stood on the same ridge where they had stood so many times before, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of crimson and gold. Their children played nearby under the watchful eyes of tribal elders. The band had grown smaller over the years as some chose reservation life, but those who remained were fiercely committed to preserving their freedom and culture. I think of that little girl sometimes, Sarah said softly, speaking in Apache now as naturally as she once spoke English. The terrified child who was saved by a brave young warrior. She could never have imagined this life, this love. Nahyo smiled, the expression lighting up his still handsome face, now marked with the scars and lines of a life fully lived. And I think of the boy who thought he was simply doing the right thing, not knowing he was meeting his destiny. The spirits work in mysterious ways. The spirits, or just extraordinary luck, Sarah teased, leaning into his embrace. With you, my heart, I need no other luck. Nahyo kissed her forehead gently. Every day with you is a day worth living, worth fighting for. You are my greatest victory, my most precious treasure. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, Sarah reflected on the winding path that had brought her here, from a frightened 7-year-old to a woman who had found her true home in the most unexpected place. She had lost much, but she had gained everything that truly mattered: love, freedom, purpose, and a partner who saw her not as property or burden, but as an equal, a companion, a beloved soul. The young Apache warrior had saved her as a child. Years later, destiny had indeed brought her back to him, and in choosing him, in choosing this life, Sarah had saved herself, not from death, but from a half-lived existence. Together, they had built something beautiful and true, a love that transcended culture and conflict, that proved humanity's capacity for connection even in the darkest times. Their story would not be remembered in history books. The Apache Wars would be recorded as a tragic chapter of westward expansion, the individual lives lost, and loves found forgotten in the broader narrative of conquest and resistance. But in the hearts of their children and the stories told around campfires for generations to come, Nahyo and Sarah would live on, proof that even in times of hatred and division, love could bridge any divide, and that sometimes the bravest choice was simply to follow your heart, wherever it might lead.